Hello and welcome to Chessy Nate. In this video, I hope to explain the fundamentals of chess and how it's played, and how all of the pieces in chess move. The first piece I would like to explain is the king. The king is the most important piece in chess. It can move in all 8 directions, and it can move only one square at a time. So let me show you some examples of king moves. Move diagonally or orthogonally. But the reason why the king is the most important piece of chess is because the whole goal of chess is to keep your king protected. So for example, if another piece attacks your king, this is called check. Now this rook is attacking the king, so I only have a few options here. The first option is to move my king out of the way. The second option is to capture the piece that's attacking. And the third option would be in a different scenario. So for example, this, I can block the attack. So the king is no longer under attack. The game of chess ends when you no longer have any moves available to protect your king. So in this example, this rook is looking at all the squares that the king can move on this rank. And once we move this black rook here, the king is under attack and it has no available squares that it can move. It can't move here, can't move anywhere. Also, white doesn't have any pieces to come in and save it by blocking it. And it has no pieces that can capture either of these rooks to save it. This is called checkmate. It is the most crucial way for a game of chess to end. There are other ways of a chess game ending, for example, resignation, time running out, or a draw, but checkmate is the key way that a game of chess will end. Now that we're familiar with the king moves and some of the basic principles of chess and how it's played, let's take a look at the rook moves. Now the rook can move in any non-diagonal direction as far as possible with only one restriction, and that restriction is that it cannot jump over any pieces. So for example, it cannot jump over this king onto this square, and it cannot jump over this rook onto this square. So it can only go as far as there are empty spaces. But what it can do is capture opponent's pieces, like that. Now let's move on to the bishop moves. The bishop is very similar to the rook, except it only can move diagonally. So here's an example of a bishop move. And here's another bishop move. Just like the rook, the bishop cannot jump over any pieces. It can only move as far as there are empty spaces. And similarly, if there is a piece on a square, the bishop can capture it. You may notice that the bishop is restricted to only one color on the board. So for example, this bishop will never be able to move to any dark squares, and this bishop will never be able to move to any light squares. The next piece, and the most powerful piece in chess, is the queen. The queen is like a combination between the rook and the bishop. It can move in all 8 directions as far as there are empty squares. So let me show you some examples of some queen moves. Just like the rook and bishop, the queen cannot jump over any pieces. It can only capture. Now let's move on to knights. The knights are a little more complicated than other pieces. They move 2 spaces in one direction and then 1 space to the side. So they can move to 8 different points. Here are some examples of knight moves. Now, what makes the knight different from the other pieces is that they can jump over any piece. They are not restricted by the pieces surrounding them. They can always jump over to any empty space, or if there is a piece on a square, they can capture it. Just like that. Pawns are the most complicated piece in chess. They move either 1 or 2 squares forward. depending on which player you are. So for example, black's pawns can only move in this direction down the board, and white's pawns can only move in this direction. So let me show you some examples of pawn moves. This pawn can move one square or two. So I'll move it one time, and I'll move this one two times. Now, this pawn, since I already moved it, can no longer move two squares. It has to move one square at a time. Now, what really makes pawns interesting is they cannot capture straight ahead. They can only capture diagonally. So let me show you an example. This pawn can either move forward or capture diagonally. But if two pawns are pressed right up against each other, they cannot capture each other. So for example, this black pawn cannot capture the white pawn, and this white pawn cannot capture the black pawn. When a pawn reaches the end of the board, this pawn can promote into any piece you decide. Usually you like to promote to a queen, but there are some instances where you might want to promote to the other pieces. But mostly the queen is the most valuable. The next move, and definitely the most difficult to remember and rare move, is called en passant. This move only applies if your pawn is on the 5th rank if you're white, or the 4th rank if you're black. And this move applies if your opponent moves a pawn 2 spaces and it's next to your pawn on the 5th rank. Then the move en passant is that you can capture this pawn. It doesn't really seem to make sense, but if you think about it, what it does is it prevents your opponent from being able to pass a pawn without any repercussions. So that's why en passant exists. It's not extremely common, and you won't see it in that many games, but it exists and it's an important move to know. Now for the final move. This move is called castling, and it only works if you have a king and a rook that have not moved. So I set it up on both sides so they can castle either way. The way castling works is you're able to move your king 2 squares to either side, and you move your rook beside it. So for example, I could have moved my king this way, and the rook would have passed over it and went beside it. And the same thing can be done on black side. Now this is a great way to make sure that your king is safe and also gets your rook out to attack. But it can only be done if the pieces haven't been moved and if there's free space in between them. Just a few more things before the video ends. I'd like to leave you with this diagram, which is a very basic way to show how all the pieces move. But the best way to get to know how the pieces move is by playing games. Another important thing to know is that each piece has their own value. A pawn is worth 1 point, a knight is worth 3 points, a bishop's worth 3 points, a rook is worth 5 points, and the queen is worth 9 points. This is important to know when you make trades. For example, you could trade the queen for a rook, a bishop, and a pawn, and that would be an equal trade because they're both worth 9 points. The queen just being 9 on its own, and rook being 5, bishop 3, and the pawn 1, adding together to make 9. If you traded your queen for 2 rooks, that would be a good trade because you would only be losing 9 points of material, and your opponent would be losing 10 points of material when it comes to their 2 rooks. So this is important to remember if you want to know whether or not a trade is worth making. Finally, I'd like to show you how the chessboard is set up. Each player has 8 pawns, 2 rooks, 2 knights, 2 bishops, 1 queen, and 1 king. Each player's queen will always be on the same colored square as their pieces. So white's queen will be on white square, and the black's queen will always be on the black square. White always moves first. Let me show you an example of what opening might look like in a game of chess. So white's going to push their pawn, and black's going to push their pawn in response. White's going to try and get their minor pieces out, like their knight and their bishop, and so is black. This pattern continues. White's going to push their pawns and minor pieces out, and so is black. White is now going to castle here, and so will black. This is just the start of a chess game, but the whole concept is developing your pieces to create an attack. Now that you know how all the pieces move and the very basic idea of how to play chess, you could play your first games of chess. Now, it's not going to be easy at first, and a lot of times you'll probably find yourself not knowing exactly what to do and what pieces to move, but the very basic idea is to just get your pieces out, defend your king, and attack your opponent's king. It's also important to remember not to make moves that will put your pieces in jeopardy. So for example, you wouldn't want to move your bishop out here because your opponent can simply capture it without any repercussions. So in summary, you want to get your pieces out in a way that's safe. You want to make sure that you don't leave your pieces hanging so that you lose them. You want to make trades that are equal or advantageous to your position. And you want to attack your opponent's king and keep your king safe. Hopefully this tutorial was helpful for you to learn the basics of chess. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, and thank you for watching.